What's going on, Chess YouTube? In today's video, I'm going to show you how Magnus Carlsen attacks the Najdorf Sicilian, aka one of Black's strongest defenses against 1e4, with the English attack starting with the move 6 bishop e3. Now, White's idea here is very simple. He wants to go f3, queen d2, long castles, then start an attack on the king side with g4 to g5, knocking off the knight off the f6 square. Now, this attacking idea is very simple, but this is White's most dangerous idea against the Najdorf Sicilian. Now, our first game in this video is Magnus Carlsen versus Liren from the 2020 Carlsen Tour Finals, and this game was epic. In the game, Magnus opens 1e4 best by test. Then Liren responds 1c5 to Sicilian Defense, then knight f3, d6, and d4, the open Sicilian. Black takes on d4, White takes back. Then finally, knight f6, knight c3, a6. This is the Najdorf with the key move a6. Black's idea is to control the b5 square, then follow up with e5 a move later. And here, of course, White has a wide variety of moves available, but in the game, he goes for the English attack, starting with the move 6 bishop to e3. Now, in the game, Liren goes for the most popular option on move 6 for Black. That is simply 6e5, breaking in the center immediately and challenging that knight on the d4 square. Now here, White has two main options. One is knight to f3. This move is playable, but it's not really the English attack move. Instead, Magnus goes for the more thematic idea, knight to b3. And from here, the idea, again, is very, very simple. White wants to go f3, queen d2, and long castles. And then after that, start an attack on the king side with the move g4 and g5. And White might even play g4 and g5 earlier before his castle, depending on what Black does here. Now from here, Liren plays the standard move in the Najdorf, that is bishop to e6. This move is a very flexible idea. From here, Black can go bishop e7 and short castle, or he can go knight to d7, perhaps rook to c8, and b5, getting counterplay on the queen side right away before castling. So both ideas from Black are very playable. Now here in the game, Magnus goes queen d2. This move is a little bit strange. Typically, White is going to go f3 first before queen d2, but queen d2 first, very playable. And now here, Liren continues with the move bishop to e7. This move and knight to d7 are roughly equally popular and real fast here. It's important to know Black cannot punish for White for going queen d2 before f3. For example, if he goes knight g4, then White simply responds bishop g5, then the best move from Black is knight to f6. And surprisingly here, the move f4 for White is actually very good, and he's fighting for a very large edge. So knight g4, not a good idea from White. Instead here, Liren just continues developing the king side with the move bishop to e7. Now here in the game, Magnus goes f3, the standard idea, again getting ready for g4, expanding on the king side. And here, Black has to make a big choice. Do you castle on the king side, or do you start counterplay somewhere? Now here, Liren once again has a very big choice. In the game, he goes for the most popular idea and the modern move. That is simply h5, gaining space on the king side and immediately stopping g4 ideas from White. So for example, if White went for the standard English attack move here, g4, then Black just takes on g4, then recaptures with the knight, and here Black has a massive advantage. So, of course, Magnus does not go g4 in this position. Now, it's important to note this move h5 does have some drawbacks. Of course, the big drawback of this move h5 from Black is that it does weaken the king side in general, and now the king pretty much has to stay on the e8 square for a while. Meanwhile, White can simply castle on the king side or on the queen side, depending on what he wants to do. So, Black losing a lot of flexibility in return for stopping that g4 idea from White temporarily. Now, from here, the standard idea for White is simply long castles. However, in this game, Magnus Carlsen throws a little bit of a curveball. He goes bishop e2 first. This is Magnus just trying to throw his opponent off guard a little bit. Now here, Liren goes knight to d7, the standard idea. Again, castles kingside when you play h5 is not recommended this early in the game. Now here, Liren, knight d7, and here, Magnus Carlsen jumps forward with the knight. Knight to d5 is the move. This is definitely the strongest idea in the position, and this is a very thematic idea in the Najdorf, but especially when Black plays the move h5. Now here, White's threat is really simple. It's simply knight takes e7. If Black wastes a move, then knight takes e7 is the move. So here, Black takes the knight on the d5 square with the bishop. Bishop takes d5 on the board. Of course, instead, knight takes d5, also perfectly playable. It's a very popular line for Black. The main line goes e takes, then bishop to f5. And from here, White can castle on the queen side or the king side, follow up with expanding on the queen side, perhaps bishop d3 at some point, challenging the bishop, and it's a very complicated game. Now, instead of that, bishop takes d5 on the board from Liren. This is the older move and potentially the stronger idea. Then Magnus takes back with the pawn. And now we have a complete transformation of the pawn structure in this game. Of course, white now has that queenside pawn majority, the 4 pawns on the queenside versus the 3 of Ding Liren. However, Ding Liren now has the kingside pawn majority, 4 on the kingside versus 3 for Magnus. Now, this means we have a very double-edged game ahead of us here. Magnus is actually going to expand on the queen side with either a4 or c4, potentially trying to create a pass pawn on the queen side. Meanwhile, Ding Liren, his main plan is to go either h4 or even e4 at some point, trying to gain space on the king side and getting counterplay. Now here, what is the main idea for Ding? Well, the best move is going to be queen to c7, a very flexible move. Again, you don't want to commit any of your pawns just yet. And from there, white's probably going to go long castles, maybe intending king b1 and c4, trying to gain more space on the queen side where he has that pawn majority. Now, instead of this, in the game, Ding Liren, instead of queen c7, he actually goes for the move b6. Now, this move is very logical if Magnus Carlsen went short castles. So, for example, if Magnus short castled here, then queen c7, and we have a very normal game, black's going to follow with a5, trying to blockade white's advances on the queen side, and then get his own kingside play going at some point with either e4 or h4. Now, of course, the drawback of the move b6 is you do prematurely commit the pawns on the queen side, and here, instead of short castles, Magnus simply castles on the queen side. And yes, long castles is the move. And now, why is b6 so bad? Well, in this structure, you actually want that pawn on the b5 square instead of b6. And that means if black ever goes b6 to b5, he essentially wasted a tempo going b5 in 2 tempos instead of 1 directly. So Magnus here essentially up an entire tempo in this game. Now Ding Liren queen c7, getting the queen onto the most flexible square, and now Magnus king b1, getting the king off that c file, and preparing potentially rook c1 ideas and maybe even c4. And finally here, Ding Liren does expand on the queen side a second time with the move b5. This is a very important Najdorf style move. And of course, this move b5 does free up the b6 square for the knight. Black may go knight to b6 next, trying to put pressure on that pawn on the d5 square and potentially threatening knight to c4 ideas. So this move b5, very important from black. Now Magnus, he has a wide variety of options that he could play. One idea is rook to g1, prepping g4, or rook to e1, just try to play solid in the center. A different idea is actually c4, immediately expanding on the queen side. So for example, c4, then b takes, and finally rook to c1, and now that pawn on the c4 square is pinned to the queen. And that means Magnus is going to have enough time to regain the pawn with either the rook or the bishop on the e2 square, and white's going to have an excellent game with very good play on the queen side despite castling there. Now instead of this, Magnus goes for a third option in the game, that is jumping forward with the knight to the a5 square. This is again a very key idea in the English attack with the move e5 from black. Now, what the heck is Magnus Carlsen's idea here? Well, it's very simple. He wants to jump into that c6 square with the knight. And this idea of knight a5 to c6 is relevant whenever you go knight d5 and recapture with the e-pawn, because then that pawn does support that c6 square, allowing knight to c6 jumping in right away. Now here, Ding Liren finds the best idea, that is knight to b6, putting pressure on that pawn on the d5 square. Of course, black is threatening knight takes d5 next, because then white could not recapture with the queen. That would be suicide, losing the queen. Okay, here, what is Magnus supposed to do? Well, he has 2 good ideas. One is simply chopping off that knight on the b6 square. That does remedy the threat of knight takes d5. And the other is to break with move c4 right away. Now c4 looks kind of strange, but it turns out it's very strong in this position. Now in the game, Magnus went for the first option, bishop takes b6. Now this is a very committal move. You do not want to give up that dark square bishop for white without a very good reason. So here, Magnus Carlsen, he takes on b6, black takes back, and then Magnus Carlsen jumps in with the knight to the c6 square, putting pressure on that bishop on e7. So although white lost the dark square bishop, overall his position is very dominant so far. Now from here, black goes bishop d8, a very curious looking move, trying to keep the bishop alive. If white does take it, then black recaptures with the rook on the a8 square, and he maintains the option of castling kingside later in the game instead of having to go king to e7 if that bishop stayed on the e7 square instead. Now here, Magnus expands on the queen side with the move c4. We talked about this move so far quite a bit, and if that c file opens up, believe it or not, it's going to be very good for Magnus, as he simply has to go rook to c1, and he will dominate that file. Now here, Ding Liren, he's already in quite a bit of trouble. What should he do in this game? Well, he has a few different options. One is simply castling and ignoring the threat of c takes b5. The other is taking on c4, And finally, you can go b4 trying to sacrifice a pawn. Let's go through those ideas one by one. Here at black castle, then white has the very simple idea of taking on b5, then going queen to b4, putting pressure on that pawn on the b5 square. And here, yes, black does have that open a file for the rook, but Magnus Carlsen at any point could go a3 trying to defend, and overall, he's a tremendous game. Here, white can play on the queen side, and then later on the king side with perhaps rook g1, prepping g4 ideas. So again, this is a very common idea in this e5 line. White here, believe it or not, can play on both sides of the board with a lot of success. Now, instead of short castles, black could also play the move b4, try to lock down the queen side. However, here, Magnus can simply take the pawn with the knight. Knight takes b4 is the move. And here, black really doesn't have sufficient compensation for that pawn. Now, in the game, Liren played potentially the strongest idea. That is simply b takes c4, opening up the b file for the attack on the white king. However, this does give white the c file, and that is going to be very good for white in this game. Now here, Magnus Carlsen simply takes on c4, and once again, Liren has that question, what the heck do you do with that king? Well, in the game, it castles short, finally. However, this does have the drawback. Now that pawn on the h5 square is a little bit weaker, and if white ever gets g4 in, then black's king side is going to be incredibly weak. Now here, Magnus, once again, what are his ideas? Well, there are a few good ones that I found. One is simply rook g1 intending g4. The other is rook h to e1 as Magnus played in the game, simply centralizing the rooks and preparing maybe the idea of f4 breaking in the center. And finally, a last idea is expanding on the queen side with the move a4. The idea is to threaten a5, try to lock down the queen side. Of course, that knight on the b5 square does support that a5 square, meaning that pawn wedge on e5 could be very stable for a very long time for white. Now in the game, white goes rook h to e1, again centralizing all of his major pieces and potentially threatening f4 next, at which point white would be very well suited for an opening of the center. Now here, Liren, he senses trouble and he plays the best move. That is simply knight to d7. The idea behind this is if white ever goes g4 and then threatening g5, that knight will be out of the way of the attack. You can potentially go knight to c5 at some point, activating the knight further. And beyond that, this bishop on d8 now has access to this entire diagonal here, and a bishop h4 resource may come in handy. Now here, instead of f4, Magnus actually breaks on the king side with the move g4. Of course, with the knight no longer on the f6 square controlling g4, this idea of g4 is very, very strong. Now, g4 on the board, black takes with the h-pawn, white takes back. And here, Liren plays the creative idea, bishop to h4. This move is very essential. First of all, it does, of course, attack the rook on the e1 square. However, beyond that, it does a great job of trying to keep this h-file closed for now. For example, if black did not go bishop h4, then white could threaten to move h4 at some point. And yes, even though the bishop does cover the h4 square, white could then go rook to h1, activating the rook on the newly opened h-file, and black would be in a lot of trouble there. So bishop h4, by far the best move for black in this position. Now here you may be wondering, where is Magnus Carlsen going to move the rook? And the answer, believe it or not, is he does not. Instead, he actually sacrifices the rook with the move g5, immediately going for the attack. Now this move g5 from Magnus was not 100% necessary. Instead, there were plenty of other good rook moves. Rook to f1 is playable. Even a rook to e3, intending rook to h3 is playable. However, this move g5 by Magnus Carlsen is also very, very strong. His idea is he's threatening g6, and that pawn is going to be a battering ram on the king side. Of course, this move does give up the rook if black wants it. So can black take the rook in this game? Well, this is a good time for a puzzle. If you like puzzles, go ahead and pause the video right now and try to assess, is bishop takes e1 a good move or a suicidal move for black? Well, it turns out bishop takes e1 is a critical mistake. Here, black takes the rook. Then white has the incredible shot, knight to e7 check. The idea is you force king to h8, and then you simply take back with the queen. You're threatening queen to h4, checking the king, and here white has a tremendous amount of threats. I mean, if you can believe it, the computer even says white has a forced mate in 8 moves here. So bishop takes e1, not a good idea at all from black. All right, what are black's options? One option is simply g6, try to blockade that pawn on the g6 square. And the other option is to expand on the king side with move f5. Now, let's investigate f5 real fast. This move looks kind of crazy, but f5 is a very typical resource in the e5 English attack from black's perspective. The idea behind this kind of move is if white ever takes en passant, black can recapture with the knight or the rook, and black here can make good use of this open f-file on the king side, sort of like how white is using the open c-file on the queen side despite being castled there. So now after f5, white's best move is g6, trying to blockade the king side, but then black can go rook a to e8, intending rook to f6 next, trying to win that pawn on the g6 square. So f5, very, very playable, and it might be the best move here. Instead, Ding Liren does go g6, try to blockade that pawn on the g5 square. Now from here, Magnus goes rook to f1, try to stop f5 ideas from black. Black goes king g7, try to get the king a little bit more to safety and opening up that aj square for the rook. Now Magnus queen g2. The idea, of course, the queen now has access to the h3 square, putting pressure on that bishop and potentially trying to take advantage of that open h-file. Now here black, rook to h8, queen g4 from Magnus, threatening that knight on the d7 square and the bishop in some lines. And here already, black has a big decision to make. What do you do about this knight on d7? Do you move it? Do you defend it? How do you defend it? Well, black's best options here are going to be queen to c7, defending the knight with the queen, or f5. Now, black goes f5 here. White has an unbelievable resource. Of course, black's king is very, very vulnerable. The queen is very active here, so white here can actually play the sacrifice rook takes f5. This is a brilliant move. The idea is after black takes with the pawn, then white recaptures with the queen. Here, believe it or not, white's attack is so strong, it actually justifies sacrificing the entire rook. Now, you can investigate this line on your own. In the game, Ding Liren did go for the move queen to c7 instead of f5, so queen c7 on the board from Ding. And now, believe it or not, the best move for Magnus is once again sacrificing the rook, this time on the f7 square. So here's how the line goes. Rook takes f7, the king is forced to take. Then you jump in with the queen to e6, forcing king g7. And then the move is knight to e7, threatening the g6 square with the knight and the queen. And here black is just completely overloaded. His king is in deep trouble. Now, instead of this move, rook takes f7, in the game, Magnus Carlsen went for the move rook to f3. This turns out to be a little bit of a mistake. His idea, of course, is to go rook to h3, trying to trap that bishop. However, real fast, the better idea would have been rook to d3, intending rook h3 with the other rook. Because here, obviously, this rook on the f1 square is very, very active, threatening the f7 pawn. However, the rook on the d1 square not doing nearly as much, currently cut off by that pawn on the d5 square. So for Magnus, activating the rook on d3, intending rook h3 would have been simply a better version of the plan he pursued in the game. Now, rook f3 on the board. And here, Ding Liren makes a very big mistake. He plays the move f5. Now, this idea of f5 in the Najdorf is very thematic. However, here it was not the best time to do it. Here, white takes on the f6 square. Black takes back with the knight, threatening the queen on g4. And here, Magnus just simply moves back his queen to the g2 square, queen g2. Now here, look at this. All of these files are opening up on the king side. Black's king is just in a lot of trouble here. What is he going to do? Well, in the game, queen d7, trying to bring the queen over to the defense up the king side. Not a bad idea. But here, Magnus, rook g1, threatening queen takes g6 next, and black has to respond. All right, rook h6, defending the pawn. And here, Magnus has an incredible attacking position, all of his pieces on wonderful squares. And here, Magnus, to be honest, he doesn't really need to press the issue immediately. In the game, he goes a3, just offering a little bit of loft for the king. The king can now go to the a2 square, literally whenever it wants, getting off the back rank. And from here, Magnus just slow plays the position a little bit. He goes rook b3, getting the rook on the open b file, then queen c2, and finally the move king to a2, just bolstering the queen side. He's in no rush. Black has all of these long-term weaknesses, the pawn on g6 and the king on h8. So overall, he is in no rush to press the issue. Now black, queen f5, offering a trade of queens. Of course, Magnus Carlsen needs those queens on the board to continue the attack. So with that in mind, queen d2 is the move, trying to keep the queens on the board. Now Ding, queen e4, further activating the queen and threatening that bishop on the c4 square. However, Magnus, he is not amused. He goes rook to c1, just further activating himself on the queen side. It's very cool to see Magnus threatening all these things on the king side and then shifting all of his pieces over to the queen side in the English attack. That is just the strength of this opening for white. You can literally attack on either side of the board here. Now ding, bishop g5, very good move, threatening various discovered attacks with the bishop. For example, knight takes d5, now being threatened by black, or even knight to e6. Now here, Magnus, he must do something about this bishop on the g5 square. You either have to move the queen, or better yet, threaten the bishop with the key move, rook to g3. Now this move is very, very cool. I want to show you a very cool line here. The move is rook g3. Of course, if black goes, say, knight to e6 or anywhere else threatening discovered attack, you simply take the bishop on the g5 square. However, even if black defends the bishop, say rook to h5, you could actually sacrifice the rook on the g5 square for the bishop. The idea is you follow up with the move queen to b4, and take a look at this. Here, there is simply no way for black to defend the d6 pawn. Literally, the only move you could do is rook d8, but of course that drops the rook on the spot. That is not a good idea. So here, no matter what black does, you simply pick up the pawn on d6, and from there you have this passed pawn on d5 that could threaten to promote on the d8 square. So in the end, here white gives up the rook on g5 in exchange for winning that d6 pawn and getting the passed pawn that could promote to a queen. So again, in the English attack, there are just so many different ideas that you can use to put pressure on your opponent. Now in the game, instead of rook g3, here Magnus goes rook c to c3. This is kind of a weird looking move. The idea is you're activating the rook on the third rank, potentially going rook to e3 next, but it really wasn't necessary, and it really doesn't address the threat of knight to e6, and this is what black does in the game. Knight to e6, threatening that queen on the d2 square with the bishop. Now, of course, here Magnus moves the queen. He goes queen to c2, offering a trade of queens, and ding, Liren does accept. Queen takes c2, and now rook takes c2. And here Magnus Carlsen did lose much of his advantage that he fought for in this game. However, now we do get to see Magnus give a masterclass in how to play this sort of English attack endgame in this opening. Here, ding, Liren jumps in with the knight. Knight d4, of course, forking those rooks. Now white takes on d4, black takes back, and then rook b6 is the move, pressuring that pawn on the d6 square as well as a6, because the bishop also attacks it right now. Now from here, bishop f4, both defending the d6 pawn and putting pressure on that pawn on the h2 square. However, white just takes the pawn on a6, black takes the rook, white takes back, and suddenly white has this queenside pawn majority, these two protected passed pawns. And Magnus Carlsen's plan is simple. He's going to march those pawns all the way down the board as fast as he possibly can. Now, ding, Liren, rook to h3, potentially threatening d3 ideas. That pawn now being defended by the rook. And a4 from Magnus, we're seeing him just start his plan. Now here, black king g7, and Magnus goes rook f2, pressuring that bishop on f4. Now bishop e3, pressuring the rook, but instead of defending, Magnus drops the bishop back to the f1 square, pressuring the rook on h3. Now, black goes bishop takes f2 here. That would be suicide, as this pawn on a4 is just too far advanced. It would promote immediately. So with that in mind, rook h5 is the move, threatening the pawn on d5. And Magnus goes rook g2, threatening the pawn on g6 and threatening bishop d3 ideas. And that's what happens in the game. Black takes that pawn on the d5 square, but Magnus here goes bishop d3, threatening g6. And now the only way to defend is rook g5, but that means the rooks come off the board. And here Magnus has a very easy plan, once again, of pushing those pawns. Now a5 is the move. Black has placed the only move to defend, bishop d8. The idea is after a6, you can go bishop b6, stopping the a7 advance. However, here Magnus just marches his king on the queen side, and in this position right here, ding, Liren resides. There is no defense against the idea of king b6, just forcing that pawn through. Black's going to sacrifice the bishop, and then the plan is b4, b5, b6, and ultimately promoting that pawn on the b8 square. And for that reason here, ding, Liren resides to Magnus Carlsen on the spot. Now in game number 2, we have Magnus Carlsen versus Ruslan Ponomaryov. He's a very strong Ukrainian grandmaster. And in this game, Russell is going to go for a slightly different option than ding, Liren went for in the last game. Here, of course, on move 6, Magnus Carlsen goes for the English attack move. That is 6, bishop to e3. And as usual, Magnus has that plan of going f3, queen d2, long castle, g4, g5, and starting the kingside attack. Now here, Ruslan, he has a big choice. As usual, he can go e5, breaking in the center, or the e6 move, or finally knight to g4. Now in this game, Ruslan goes for the second option. That is the move e6. Now the idea behind this move is very simple. It is the Scheveningen style move, black getting those pawns on the d6 and e6 squares, fighting for control of all of these central squares here in the middle of the board. Now the disadvantage of this move over the idea of e5 is black lacks space in the center, and white is a very easy time going f3, g4, g5, and expanding on the king side. Now here Magnus goes 7 f3, the standard English attack idea, and once again from here you can go either queen d2 long castles, or for an immediate g4 and g5 expanding on the king side. Now already here black has a very important decision to make. What is he going to do from here to stop white's idea? Well, there are two main ideas. The first one involves going bishop e7 and short castles. And according to most grandmasters, this plan is actually very, very weak. Instead, here black needs to start getting counterplay going on the queen side with the move b5 immediately. Now, real fast, I do want to run through black's options. If black does go for that kingside castles idea, this is very weak. All Magnus has to do is go queen d2, and then long castles, and from here the plan is simple: g4, g5, trying to knock off that knight, then h4, h5, and g6, and white's attack literally plays itself. So overall, this plan's very, very weak. If your opponents play this against you, you should be very, very happy. You're going to have a very easy game as white. Now, alternatively, there is that other idea of expanding on the king side here with the move h5. We saw this in the line where black went 7 e5, instead of 6 e5 instead of 6 e6. However, here this move is a little bit weaker. From here, white can simply go queen d2, and then believe it or not, almost anything white wants to do from here is extremely playable. For example, if you want to go bishop e2 with a short castles, you can do that. If you want to go long castles, you can do that. If you want to go bishop c4 and then a4, try to clamp down on the queen side and targeting the weak square on e6, you can do that. Pretty much anything you want to do as white here is playable. And for that reason, this move h5 really isn't that popular for black in this line with e6. It's mostly seen in the line with e5. Now, going back to the game, the most dangerous move for black here, and in a good way, is the move b5, expanding on the queen side and immediately threatening the idea of b4. Now, why is this move so good? Well, again, black needs to get counterplay going on the queen side immediately. And from here, his plan may include knight d7, bishop b7, queen c7. And from there, he could even leave his king in the middle of the board and simply counterattack with the move b4 on the queen side. So overall, this is what black's going for here. Now in the game, Magnus follows up with the move queen d2. Of course, g4 also playable, but computers seem to show here black has a good game after b4. This is still playable for white, but instead queen d2 by Magnus is the best move in this position. So as a general rule of thumb, if you go bishop e3, then f3, then queen to d2, that's generally a good idea. Then you can decide if you want to go long castles or g4 first. Now from here in this position, Ruslan goes knight to d7, the very standard Najdorf style move, and of course his plan is to follow up potentially with bishop e7 and queen to c7. Now real fast, I do want to show you if black goes b4 here or in almost any position in this e6 line of the Najdorf. Here, white has a big choice. He can either go knight to e2 or knight to a4. Both of these moves are very playable. Now, b4 from black is not bad by any means. However, white is also doing very, very well here. Now, in this position, knight to a4 works very well. And there's a very important tactical idea I want to show you. What happens if black goes queen to a5? Well, this idea shows up again and again in the e6 version of the English attack. Here's what happens. If black goes queen to a5, the best move from white is actually b3, defending the knight. Now, if this is your first time seeing this position, you may be wondering what happens if black goes bishop d7, threatening bishop takes a4, then queen takes a4 after b takes a3. I mean, isn't black just winning a pawn here? Well, very importantly, white has the key resource here, a3. This idea is going to pop up again and again in these e6 lines. You just have to know this move a3 here. Now, the idea is if black takes the knight on the a4 square, you take the pawn on b4, and suddenly the bishop on a4 is pinned to the queen, and that pawn on b4 is defended by the white queen. The queen now has to retreat to the c7 square, and then you take on a4. Now, typically, white's already castled when black does this. So typically, b takes a4 is the only move. However, here, rook takes a4 is even better. But overall, you just got to understand these b takes a4 style positions where white wins a pawn. Despite having the weakened pawns on the queen side, white can still castle on the king side here, and white is going to be doing outstanding. So whenever you see this early b4 advance from black, you have to understand knight to e4 is a very playable idea, although knight to e2 in this position and in others is also very good for white. Now, heading back to the game, knight d7 on the board. This is the strongest move for black, and of course the idea bishop b7, queen c7, and b4 coming up next. Now here, Magnus does have a choice. He can either castle long on the queen side, or he can start the immediate king side attack with the move g4. Both of those moves are about equally effective. So either way, you're doing just fine if you play either of these moves. Now in the game, Magnus does expand on the queen side with the move g4. Now, it's very important to note, Magnus only did this when black already went knight to d7. Let's go back a move to this position right here. If Magnus here goes g4, then the threat of g5 isn't as scary because that knight has access to the d7 retreat square. Now, fast forwarding to this position here when Magnus actually goes g4, of course, that knight on f6 doesn't have d7 to retreat to, and that means g4 in this position is a little bit stronger. Now in the game, black stops the pawn advance with the move h6. Of course, if white advances g5, black is simply going to take back on the g5 square, and that will activate the rook on the h8 square, which is to black's benefit. So for that reason, Magnus does not go g5. Instead, he simply long castles, completing his queenside development. And this is really the end of the opening phase of this game, and this is where things get really exciting in this game. Now, from here, black has a few different options. Once again, going bishop e7 and short castles is not a good idea. If black does that, all white has to do is go h4, g5, blow open the king side, and from there, black's king is going to be checkmated in short order, so that is not a good idea. Instead, black can go bishop b7 to try to continue queenside development. Now, if black does that, here white has a wide variety of moves. A3 is possible, stopping the b4 advance. H4 is possible, intending rook g1 and then g5. And also the immediate rook g1, also possible here. So overall, white has a wide variety of plans if black slow plays it. Now the strongest move here, instead of bishop b7, is actually the idea of b4, immediately challenging that knight on the c3 square. Now from here, both the moves knight to a4, as we saw earlier, and the move knight to e2 is very, very playable. If white goes knight e2, this is good for white. Here's a sample line. Black may go queen c7, then white can follow up h4. The idea is perhaps rook g1 and then g5. On the other hand, if white goes knight to a4, it's a good idea to have in mind if you want to mix things up. Then the main line here actually goes knight to e5. Now this pawn on the b4 square is hanging. Of course, white can take it. That is the best move. Queen takes b4. And then if black goes bishop d7, trying to challenge the knight and potentially intending rook b8 next, then white simply retreats the knight to the c3 square. And as usual, if black instead goes for the move queen to a5 in this position, try to challenge the knight, then you just go b3, and the knight is defended, and white can actually follow up with a3, intending a takes b4, as that pawn is currently pinned. If the pawn moves, then the queen on the a5 square actually falls. These are some common ideas you may encounter in your own games, just good things to keep in mind. Now, in the game, black did not go for the strongest idea, b4. Instead, Ruslan Ponomarev tried to shock Magnus Carlsen with a very unusual move, knight to e5. Now, what's the idea behind this move? Well, it's a very common idea in the Najdorf, in the Dragon Sicilian, and other variations of the Sicilian defense. Here, black threatens knight to c4 ideas that would, of course, fork both the bishop on e3 and the queen on d2. This would force white to give up the dark squared bishop or that bishop on the f1 square, both of which are not good options, and beyond that, it also threatens the pawn on f3. And if white ever goes f4, then I will also target the pawn on the g4 square. So overall, the knight is reasonably active on e5. However, again, b4 immediately would have been a better move for black here. Now, in this position, what is Magnus Carlsen supposed to do? Well, as usual, in these e6, d6 English attack lines, white has a wide variety of ideas. For example, a3 is playable, rook g1 is good, h4 is good, all these very good moves. But here, if Magnus Carlsen decides to return the favor, and he wants to shock Ruslan Ponomarev with a weird-looking move of his own. So with that in mind, here Magnus retreats the queen back to the e1 square. Now, this is a very curious looking move. It is common in certain lines of the Dragon Sicilian, but here it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Yes, white is opening up the rook on the d file, potentially threatening something taking on d6 in the future, but it's not really clear what the queen is doing on the e1 square over d2. Now, from here, black goes queen c7, the best square for the queen typically in this line. And now Magnus here, he really needs to think about playing the prophylactic move a3, stopping the b4 advance from black, trying to punish black for not playing the move earlier in the game. However, instead of that, here Magnus immediately tries to start the kingside attack with the move h4, and finally black is in time to punish Magnus for this with the move b4. And after this move, we have a game. It's not really clear if white or black is better in this position. All right, as usual, white here has a big choice. You can either go to e2 or to a4. In this position, both moves are quite playable. Now from here, Magnus does retreat knight c to e2. This is a very aggressive idea. Now the knight is further away from the defense of the king. It's closer to the king side where it can help start that attack. And this means white's attack is going to hit faster, but black's attack on the queen side is also going to come a lot faster as well. Now the alternative, knight to a4, may be even stronger, but this move leads to insane complications. Here the best computer line shows black going d5, simply breaking in the center and guarding that b4 pawn with the bishop. Of course, the queen was targeting it just a move prior. And here the computer seems to think for white the best idea is actually g5 and immediately starting the kingside attack. Now, of course, this would have been insanely complicated. Overall, I quite like Magnus Carlsen's idea of responding knight c to e2 in the game as opposed to knight to a4. Keeping the knight on the e2 square, although it is a little bit worse, does keep the position simpler overall, which is to Magnus Carlsen's benefit in this game. Now from here, black jumps in with the knight to the c4 square, targeting that bishop on e3, just as we talked about earlier. That, of course, was one of the key ideas of knight to e5 earlier in this game, setting up knight to c4 ideas. Now here, Magnus Carlsen should really think about keeping that bishop on e3 alive. For that reason, either bishop f2 or perhaps bishop g1 would have been the right idea. Personally, I kind of like bishop f2 better, the idea being to keep the rook, the g1 square open for the rook, but bishop g1, also very playable according to the computer. However, instead of retreating the bishop, here Magnus simply jumps forward with the knight. Knight to f4 played in the game. This is a slightly dubious move as now white loses that dark squared bishop. Black takes on e3, white takes back with the queen. And now because of this, white is going to be much weaker on the dark squares in this game. Now from here, just take a quick look at this position. If you are even a beginner-level chess player, you may have spotted the idea that black can fork the two knights on d4 and f4 with the move e5. Now, did Magnus Carlsen miss something? Is this really a threat? What's going on here? Well, in the game, if black were to go e5, this would be a massive mistake. Here, white can jump in with the knight to the d5 square, targeting the queen on c7. And here, if black were to take the knight on d5 with the knight, let's say knight takes d5, removing the threat against the queen, then white can take back, and suddenly that pawn on the e5 square is being pinned to the king. E takes d4 is not possible because that would put the king in check. And of course, from here, the knight could jump into the c6 square, to the f5 square. I mean, there are so many dangerous threats for white in this position. So all this to say, in this position here, e5 from black, it looks very tempting, but knight d5 is a perfectly good antidote for Magnus Carlsen, and for that reason, Ruslan Ponomaryov does not play that in the game. Now from here, what should black be doing? Well, it turns out when white doesn't have that dark squared bishop, black's king is a lot safer on the king side. And for that reason here, black should start thinking about how to castle his king, and that means developing the bishop on the f8 square. Now the best moves here for black are going to be bishop e7, intending short castles, or instead of that, the move g6, intending bishop g7, and only then short castles. So either way, black would have a very good game in this kind of position. However, instead of that, here Ruslan immediately starts to counterattack on the queen side with the move queen to b6. The idea of this move, of course, is the knight on d4 is now pinned to the queen, and the threat of e5 is getting more and more serious. However, beyond that, his queen on the b6 square also supports the idea of an a5 to e4 and then b3 advance with the pawns on the queen side. And if black pulled that off, white's king on the queen side would be incredibly vulnerable. Now here, Magnus Carlsen, he decides to jump in with the bishop to the c4 square. This move is now possible now that black went b4. When the pawn was on b5, of course, bishop c4, not a good idea. You'd lose the bishop. However, with b4 on the board, bishop c4 is a fantastic move, And just look at this position, the bishop, the knight, and the knight all overloading the e6 square. I mean, you don't have to be a very stable chess genius like Magnus Carlsen to realize that a piece sacrifice on the e6 square is inevitable in this kind of position. Now here it is black to move, and once again we have to calculate, is this idea of e5 dangerous for black or is it a bad idea? Well, it turns out in this position it is a very bad idea, even worse than on the move prior, and here's why. If black goes e5, the threat from white is not knight to d5. In fact, it's even more dangerous. Here, white can sacrifice the bishop on the f7 square. Bishop takes f7 is the move, and here's the idea. If the king takes, then there's a queen transfer you see a lot in the Italian opening for white. That is the move queen to b3, targeting the king, and then the best move for black is king to e8, trying to get out of trouble, but then white can jump in with the knight to the g6 square. And from here, you're targeting the rook. If the rook moves to g8, the queen simply picks it off. The rook has no good squares to go to. And overall, white is absolutely dominating this position. So e5, not a good move on move 16 here because of that bishop takes f7 threat from white. Now, what else can black do? It turns out the best move here is knight to d7. The idea is you're trying to get the knight out of the way of a future g5 advance. Of course, now that white went bishop c4, these rooks on d1 and h1, they are connected to each other, and that means g5 is a threat. If white goes g5, black takes a white takes, that rook on h1 is no longer hanging as the other rook does defend it. So overall, this move knight d7 gets out of the way of that attack. However, it does weaken the e6 square, and that means here white, of course, has that sacrifice on the e6 square, and here black's king is just blown the f open. This is going to be incredibly dangerous for him. Now, instead of knight d7, that was the strongest move here for black, even though it does weaken that critical e6 square. Here in this position, Ruslan Ponomarev goes for the move queen to c5. Now, this move has the idea of targeting that weak, vulnerable bishop on the c4 square. However, it is a big drawback. Here, Magnus simply defends the bishop with that same queen transfer, queen to b3. And now get a load of this, that two knights and the bishop and the queen are all overloading that pawn on the e6 square, and of course that pawn is not long for the world. Now here, what the heck is black supposed to do to hold off Magnus Carlsen's raging English attack? Well, according to the computer, the best defensive idea is queen to e5, trying to centralize the queen and supporting the e6 square with the queen. But of course here, white could also just sacrifice the knight on the e6 square, and this would be very difficult for black to defend. Now, instead of that, in the game, black goes for the move d5. This is actually a very common thematic break in this e6 English attack line. And this move has many different ideas. One is trying to gain space in the center of the board, and beyond that, it's also trying to activate this bishop on the f8 square. That bishop now having an open line of attack all the way down the board. Now, from here, Magnus does take on d5. This is the weakness of this move. And now here, of course, e takes d5 is absolute suicide. If black went that, white's going to follow up rook h to e1, targeting the king. And from there, he's going to win back that pawn on the d5 square. And, you know, black pretty much has no chance in this kind of position. So with that in mind, instead here, black, he goes for the move bishop to d6. This is very strong, actually. The multi-purpose move, you're both targeting the knight on the f4 square, and you're setting up short castles, which would get your king to safety. So very good idea from black, but of course, Magnus Carlsen, he's not slowing down. He does not waste any time defending the knight on the f4 square. Instead, he immediately jumps in with the knight sacrifice. That's right, knight f takes e6 on the board. And now here, black has literally no choice but to take the knight. If you don't, white's threatening g7. White's up a free pawn. That powerful pawn on d5 is going to be a menace. So, of course, f takes e6 is black's only chance. But then after d takes e6, just look at this. Black's king literally never going to be safe in the center or on the king side. White has the 4 versus 2 pawn majority on the king side. And that means these pawns are just going to start rolling up the board, and black's king is in deep trouble here. Now, of course, white is down a piece. Black has those 3 minor pieces versus white's 2, and that does give him some fighting chances in the game. And from here, Ruslan Ponomarev plays the strongest move. That is bishop to e7, stopping any e7 ideas from white. So, for example, if he didn't play this, let's say any other move, perhaps bishop b7, tried to target f3, then white could actually go e7 in stealth. This move stops short castles. Of course, short castles would go into check now. And beyond that, if black ever takes that pawn on the e7 square, then white can follow up rook to e1. And again, look at these rooks on the e-file. This is very dangerous for black. Now going back, this move bishop e7 played in the game, best possible move for black. And here Magnus Carlsen, he wastes no time putting more pressure on the king. He jumps in with the queen to the d3 square, threatening queen g6 check. And if Magnus gets that move in, then black's king is permanently going to be stuck in the center. Now, of course, there were alternatives here. The move g5 is the strongest according to the engine here. And the idea of this is, of course, that rook on h1 is defended by the rook on d1, and black has no good response. Either retreating the knight or going h takes g5 would just create more weaknesses for black. Now, instead, queen d3 on the board for Magnus. And here black, he finally gets his king over to the king side, his short castles. Now, this was a good idea. However, the king is quite vulnerable there. Here, Magnus, once again, has the very easy idea of g5, sacrificing a pawn. The queen can technically win it back after h takes g5, h takes, then queen takes. However, this would open up the h-file for the rooks, and overall, this would be just a devastating idea for Magnus. Now, instead, Magnus decides to start slow playing the position. He goes bishop b3, and to be honest, this is the start of a slightly weaker overall plan for Magnus. Now, fortunately here for Magnus, black goes rook d8 in the game. This turns out to be a big weakness. Instead, the move bishop b7 is necessary. The ideas are setting up rook to c8 ideas, and finally, that rook on the a8 square can jump into the game. Now, instead, rook d8 on the board, and here Magnus does not miss his chance to sacrifice the pawn with the move g5. Now here, after this move g5 from Magnus, the first thing you have to ask is what happens if black takes on g5 with the pawn, then the queen? Well, it turns out that would be a fatal mistake. So for example, h takes, then queen takes. What's the problem with this? I mean, you just win a pawn with a gain of tempo on the white king. Well, it's very simple. Here, white just responds king to b1, and then the follow-up idea, no matter what black does, let's say bishop b7, is going to be rook d to g1. And now look at this. Both of these rooks lining up with the king, the pawn on the e6 square blocking off f7. I mean, this is an absolute disaster for black. The knight's coming to f5. You may even sacrifice a rook on g7 at some point. And here black is going to get blown off the board. So h takes g5, then queen takes, not a viable strategy. For that reason here, Ruslan Ponomaryov goes knight to h7, just retreating the knight and trying to keep the game going. However, here Magnus, he doesn't slow down. He takes on the h6 square. G takes h6 is the move, and he actually gives up the knight on d4 if black wants it. Now, why the heck did Magnus do that? I mean, after all, after knight to h7, rook takes d4 was a legitimate threat. Well, here's the idea. If black takes on d4 with the rook takes d4, then Magnus jumps in with the queen to the g6 square, and suddenly Magnus is threatening checkmate in one move, and black has a very difficult time defending against this threat. Now, instead of that, after g takes h6, the move for black is queen to h5, trying to guard the king side with the queen. But here, Magnus, queen to e4. Now, of course, the queen getting out of the way of the attack of the rook, the knight no longer pinned, and the queen targeting that weak rook on the a8 square. Now, here, black takes on h6. That does target the white king. The white king goes to king b1. Then rook to a7, getting out of the way of the attack of the queen on the a8 square. But now Magnus, he starts to go for the finishing blow. Knight to f5, targeting the queen, also targeting the rook on the d8 square. Now black takes the rook with check. White takes back. Queen to f6, getting out of the way of the attack of the knight. But here, Magnus Carlsen has a move that is so devastating, it nearly wins on the spot. If you like puzzles, go ahead and try solve this one right here. Try to find the best idea for white. If you can find this move, kudos to you, my friend. You deserve 5 Happy Meals. The key move for white here is the move rook d7. Wow, what a shocker. Of course, the idea is that black takes the rook with the bishop or the rook on a7. White's going to recapture with the e-pawn, and that's going to expose the king to an attack, and white's going to have that pass pawn on d7. So, for example, rook takes d7 is suicide. White takes on d7 with the pawn, and now you have the double attack on the king and the bishop. White's going to get a new queen. That is game over. Now, instead here, black takes with the bishop. Bishop takes d7 is the move. E takes d7 from Magnus. Now king f8. And finally, the key move, queen d5. Now from here, Magnus Carlsen is threatening checkmate on the g8 square. and black literally has zero good responses to this threat. And for that reason, in this position, Ruslan Ponomaryov resigns on the spot to Magnus Carlsen. Now in game number 3, Magnus Carlsen is facing off against Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave, one of the biggest Najdorf specialists in the world, and this game is absolutely incredible. Here, of course, Magnus goes for the English attack with the move 6 bishop e3. And here, instead of e6 or e5, as in the last 2 games, here Maxime plays the move knight to g4. This move is very, very critical. Black takes advantage of the fact that white has not played f3 here yet, and he immediately challenges that bishop on the e3 square. Now here, if white simply retreats the bishop to c1, black's going to go back with the knight back to the f6 square. For example, bishop c1, then knight to f6, and we have that starting position of the Najdorf. And this is a well-known draw by repetition, so obviously white doesn't want that. However, he also can't allow black to simply take the bishop on the e3 square. For example, queen d2 is a big blunder. Then black takes the bishop, white takes back. And here white lost his precious dark square bishop. Black has the bishop pair, and here black is arguably even a little bit better in this position, so white does not want to allow that. So with that in mind, here in this position, the only good move for white, if you want to fight for the advantage out of the opening, is the move bishop g5. So that's what we're going to cover in this game. I'm going to show you exactly how Magnus Carlsen counters this move knight to g4 with this bishop move to the g5 square. Now, what's the idea here? Well, if black does nothing, white's going to go f3, knocking the knight back, then go queen d2 and long castles. So with that in mind, here black has to do something immediately about that bishop on g5. Now, the best move here for black is going to be h6. The idea is pushing the bishop back to h4, then you go g5, forcing it back to the g3 square, and then you go bishop g7 with some kingside development and counterplay against the bishop and against white's center. Now, very importantly, if black doesn't do that, there's not a whole lot he can do. e6 and e5 are not possible as that pawn is pinned on the e7 square to the queen. So, for example, what else could black do? Well, knight c6 is the other best move, but here it's not even that good. In this case, white, again, simply knocks that knight back to the f6 square, then takes on c6, and finally goes bishop c4, and from here, white can castle on the king side or on the queen side after moving the queen, and white's going to have a tremendous game in this position. So with that in mind, h6 from black is the only serious move on move 7 for him to try and defend. So h6 on the board for Maxime, then bishop h4, and finally g5, bishop g3, and bishop g7 from black. And again, there are some alternatives, but this is the only serious attempt for black to fight for equality. Everything else gives white a huge edge. So this is the main idea you have to watch out for from black. Now here, Magnus Carlsen continues with the strongest idea. That is simply queen d2, intending long castles next. Now, of course, queen d2 wasn't the only idea. h3 is also possible here. From there, the knight jumps to the e5 square. And after that, white is going to have a whole bunch of different ideas he could try. Knight to f5, h4, f3, queen d2, and so on. But again, queen d2, by far the best move in this position. It's also Magnus Carlsen approved, so that is the one we're going to focus on in this game. Now here, black, he has a big decision to make. What the heck are you supposed to do about your development? And how do you put pressure on white's center? Well, it's important to note here, if black simply castles, that is a big, big mistake. White's going to continue with the move h4, and this pawn on the g5 square is just a massive hook for white, and black's kingside is going to be blown open. So overall, short castles is kind of suicide for black here. With that in mind, the best move for black is the move knight to c6, and the idea behind this is very obvious. Black is putting pressure on that knight on the d4 square, and here castles from white is not possible trying to defend the knight, because then black simply takes the knight on d4 with the knight or the bishop, and here obviously the queen cannot take back on d4, as then the bishop takes the queen. So knight to c6, a very good move, forcing white's hand. He's going to have to either take on c6 or retreat the knight somewhere, as there's really no other good way to defend the knight here. Now, the first question you have to ask is, taking on c6 a good idea in this position? Well, the answer is not really. If white takes on c6, black takes back. And then if white castles, black's simply going to go queen to a5, followed by rook to b8, and then black is going to have a huge amount of pressure on this b file, and with the queen on the a file. Overall, this is really not a good position for white. I mean, also this bishop on the g7 square slicing down the board. Bishop takes c3 is going to be a threat at some point. So all that being said, knight takes c6, not a very good idea for white here. Instead, the best way to deal with the threat of simply knight takes d4 is going to be knight to b3, retreating the knight and maintaining the tension in the position. Now here, what is black supposed to do? Well, he has a few different ideas. One is simply retreating this knight on g4 back to the e5 square. It is quite vulnerable on g4, and at any moment, white could play f3 or h3, try to counterplay against the knight, so that's not a bad idea. However, it doesn't really put a whole lot of pressure on white's position. Instead, here, Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave goes b5, expanding on the queen side, and overall, quite a good move. Here, black is technically threatening b4, at which point this knight on the c3 would have to move, maybe to d5, but then the pawn on the b2 square would be hanging to the bishop on the g7 square. So b5 does come with the threat of b4 here, winning a pawn. Now, what is Magnus Carlsen going to do about it? Well, long castles is an option. From there, the king does defend that b2 square. Perfectly viable idea. However, in the game, Magnus goes for an even stronger move, and that is the idea of h4 attacking black's kingside. Now, this idea of h2 to h4 is really white's big idea in this knight to g4 line from black in the Najdorfs. Of course, if white can open up the kingside, that is going to be massive. He's going to have tons of attacking chances, and black's king is never going to be safe in the center or on the kingside. So that being said, what is black supposed to do here? Well, first of all, letting white take on g5 is not a good option at all. So with that in mind, black here is going to take on h4, or he's going to play that idea of b4, trying to win the pawn on the b2 square. Let's go through that second option first. Here, b4 is a very good move. White has to jump to d5 with the knight. This is by far the best square for the knight. And then black takes the pawn on the b2 square with the bishop. This forces out rook to b1 from white. Then black can go g takes, bishop takes, then retreat the bishop. And here it looks like black is simply up an entire pawn. However, white has some dangerous compensation in the spirit of the poison pawn variation of the Najdorf. And yes, he can simply go bishop e2 and then short castles, and believe it or not, white here is an excellent game thanks to his very well-placed pieces and lead in development. Now, b4, a very good move from black in this position, try to win that pawn. However, in the game, Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave goes for the other idea. That is g takes h4, trying to win that pawn on the h4 square. Now, from here, white can either recapture with the bishop or with the rook. Both moves are perfectly playable in the game. Magnus takes with the bishop. However, rook takes h4 is also perfectly fine in this position. Now, instead, bishop takes h4 on the board. And here, black is a very critical decision. What the heck do you do about your pieces and the king stuck in the middle of the board? Well, it turns out here, the critical idea for black is going to be getting that knight back to the e5 square and then threatening knight to c4, trying to put pressure on the queen and that pawn on b2. And from there, if white takes the knight on the c4 square, black takes back with the b pawn, which does open up the b file for black's rook. So, for example, here, knight g to e5, the best move. White's best move is knight d5. Then black can jump into the c4 square, basically forcing white to knock off that knight on the c4 square. But then black, once again, gets the open b file for the rook, and here we have a very tense middle game position with chances for both sides. Now, instead of this, Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave, in the game, he brings his bishop to the e6 square. Now, this is a very logical idea. We see it a lot in the Sicilian Dragon when the bishop is on g7. The bishop is pretty active on the e6 square, and we can see these bishops slicing down the board into white's queen side. That looks very attractive. However, it's a little bit slow. Here, white simply castles, and again, it's not really clear what black is going to do about his king position in this game. Now, from here, once again, the best move for black is knight g to e5, trying to centralize the knight. However, instead, here, Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave jumps in with the other knight to the e5 square, knight c to e5. And this turns out to be quite a bit weaker. Here, white plays f3, driving the knight back to the f6 square, f6 being really the only viable retreat square in this position. And here, white has at least two very good ideas that make use of the vulnerable position of the bishop on the e6 square. So in the game, Magnus Carlsen simply goes knight to d4, pressuring e6. However, another very good idea was the idea of f4, intending f5 on the next move, forcing the bishop back. So again, this move bishop to e6 from black looking very premature here. Now in the game, knight d4 from Magnus, and black goes rook to c8. Of course, that was one of the ideas of bishop to e6 that frees up the c8 square for black's rook. However, Magnus doesn't really mind. Here he has two good options. One is knight takes e6, simply winning the bishop pair and damaging black's pawn structure, and the other is the one he did in the game, king to b1, getting the king off the open c-file here. Now in this position, the Najdorf expert Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave, he plays yet another big mistake. He moves the bishop to the c4 square, and his idea is to try to get white to go bishop takes c4, at which point he can recapture with the knight, the b-pawn, or the rook on c4. Now that would be good for black if Magnus Carlsen went for it. However, instead, in the game, Magnus jumps to the vulnerable f5 square with the knight. This is the key idea. As soon as that bishop leaves this diagonal from the e6 square, then the knight simply jumps in and pressures the bishop on g7. Now black is in a world of trouble. Obviously, castling on the king side is not a viable option. Then that pawn on the h6 square hangs, and white is nearly winning here with the open h-file. So with that in mind, instead of short castles, here black is forced to go king to f8, defending the bishop. But this is an ugly move to make. Now here Magnus, he finds a very simple tactic to win a pawn. First, he takes the knight on the f6 square, and now no matter what black does to recapture, he's in trouble. If black takes on f6 with the bishop, then the pawn on h6 falls and Magnus picks it up with the rook. For example, bishop takes, then rook takes. However, if black takes on f6 with the e-pawn, then once again, white can win the h6 pawn all the same, and this permanently damages black's pawn structure on the king side. And effectively, this is a strategically lost position for black, so obviously no matter what black does, he's in trouble. Now in the game, he takes back with the bishop, trying to preserve his pawn structure a little bit, and Magnus simply takes on h6 with the rook, as we talked about. Now from here, the obvious threat from white is going to be rook takes h8, followed by queen to h6. If black does nothing, that is going to be a serious threat from white, so obviously black cannot allow this in the game. So with that being said, what the heck is he supposed to do? Well, in the game, black retreats the knight to the g6 square, trying to defend h8. However, this is a big mistake. Instead, maybe Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave should have thought about rook takes h6, and then after the queen takes back, moving the king back to the e8 square. Perhaps that would have been a better idea. But instead, knight g6 on the board. And here Magnus just goes in full beast mode. He takes the rook on h8, the bishop takes back, then he swings in the queen to the h6 square. Obviously, bishop g7 is not possible. The bishop would hang, so black has to move the king here. So king e8 on the board. Then Magnus takes on the c4 square with the bishop, and now no matter what black does to recapture, rook takes c4 or b takes c4, white is going to jump in with the other knight to the d5 square, and from there he's going to have overwhelming pressure with the knights pressuring the e7 pawn. So in the game, Maxime takes with the b-pawn, not a bad idea, trying to open up the b-file for the rook, and maybe black can get some pressure between the rook and the bishop on the h8 square. However, here Magnus, he just jumps in with the knight to d5, and now there's a tremendous amount of pressure on that pawn on e7. Now, of course, Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave is a very scrappy defender. He loves to counterattack, and here he finds the move rook to b8, putting pressure on this pawn on the b2 square. And if white is not careful, rook takes b2 or bishop takes b2 is coming next. Now here, Magnus, what the heck should he do in this position? Well, it turns out here the best move is simply c3, stopping the attack from the bishop, and this knight on the d5 square does cover the c3 square. That way, if black plays bishop takes c3, knight takes c3, covers it, and the rook's pin on the pawn on b2 isn't relevant yet. So that was the best idea, but why am I saying this? Well, in the game, Magnus goes off the deep end, and he simply takes the pawn on the e7 square. Now, this move is insane. First of all, knight takes e7, taking the knight is not the move for black. Obviously, that will hang the bishop on the h8 square. So with that in mind, the knight on e7 is definitely not hanging. However, it simply leaves the pawn on b2 to be free to be taken. And here, Maxime punishes white for this mistake. He plays the move bishop takes b2. This is much stronger than rook takes b2, because here after bishop takes b2, black has this discovered attack on the king as soon as the bishop moves. For example, black here is actually threatening bishop to g7 with the check by the rook, and if white is not careful, he's going to lose his queen on the very next move. So with that in mind, here Magnus Carlsen plays the move c3, trying to defend. So of course now if black takes the pawn on the c3 square, he does have a check on the king from the rook. However, Magnus can simply go king to c2, and white's king is going to be relatively okay there. Now, the best move for black in this position, of course, is going to be queen to a5. You now have the queen activating, targeting the c3 pawn, plus putting pressure on the pawn on a2, and you still have that rook targeting the king with the x-ray attack. However, unfortunately for Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave, he did not see this. Instead, bishop takes c3 was the move, And again, the bishop's not hanging yet. The knight cannot take because the rook is putting pressure on the king right now. However, Magnus has that move king to c2. And now Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave plays the move queen to a5, supporting the bishop and pressuring that pawn on a2. Here, Magnus just takes the bishop on c3. And now, how is Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave going to continue this attack? Now here, black simply takes the knight on the e7 square with the king, and white drops the queen all the way back to the d2 square, trying to defend the queen side here. Now, in this position, Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave actually has a way to force the queens off the board and try to get equality. The best way to do that is queen to a3, threatening queen b2 check. That would be deadly. And for that reason, white has to retreat the queen back to the c1 square guarding, but then black can take the queen. Queen takes c1, king takes c1. And finally, we have an equal-ish endgame where both sides have 4 pawns, the knights and the rooks. Now, instead of this, in this position here, Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave brings the queen over to the c5 square, again trying to put continued pressure on white's king. However, this does not cut it. Here, white, knight d5, hitting the king with the knight, and black's king actually goes back to the e8 square. This turns out to be a little bit of a mistake. The king may have been better placed on d7, where it's a little bit closer to the queen side and away from danger. Now, king e8 on the board from black, and here Magnus goes queen to c3, threatening all sorts of ideas with the queen. Queen to h8, queen to f6, and g7 in some lines are possible. Now here, black jumps in with the knight to the e5 square, cutting off the queen's access to the king's side, and now Magnus increases the pressure with f4, a very committal move. Of course, does weaken the pawn on the e4 square, but on the other side, it does pressure that knight on e5. Now here, Maxime jumps in with the queen to the new vulnerable f2 square, queen to f2, both attacking f4 and the king on c2. Now queen d2 from Magnus, and Maxime jumps in with the knight to the d3 square, getting it off e5 where it was being attacked by the pawn. Now finally, the queens do come off the board here. Queen takes f2, and it turns out black actually has the intermediate move, rook to b2 check, instead of immediately capturing the queen on f2. However, knight takes f2 played in the game, and now rook d4 from Magnus, targeting the pawn on c4. And at this point, we're no longer really in the territory of the English attack. However, I do want to show you the endgame really fast. It is a pretty cool endgame from Magnus. Here, Magnus simply picks up that pawn on the c4 square and then starts to centralize his pieces, increasing the pressure. Here, Magnus targeting the pawn on the a6 square. Black gives the check. King to c3 from Magnus. Then f5, defending the pawn on f4 that was being attacked. And then finally, eventually picking up that pawn on the a6 square after further exchanges. And now from here is a classic example of Magnus converting his extra pawn in the endgame, 3 pawns versus black's 2. His idea is to simply activate his king and his rook as much as possible, and then target black's weak pawns while pushing this pawn down the board on the queen side. As we can see, Magnus Carlsen just showing his famous endgame technique. He's perhaps one of the best endgame players in the history of chess, and in this position, Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave resigned as that pawn on a7 is defended, and there's no way to block the idea of rook to b7 followed by rook b8, basically forcing through the promotion of that pawn on the a8 square. Now heading into game number 4, Magnus Carlsen is facing off as white against Daniel Naroditsky, the blitz specialist, as black, and of course Daniel going for the Najdorf variation of the Sicilian defense. And here Magnus Carlsen has a choice. In most of these games, he's gone bishop e3, that is the standard English attack move. However, in the game, he does go 6 f3, the other idea. Of course, Magnus is going to follow up with 6 bishop e3. The advantage of this move is you do stop knight to g4 ideas from black that you would have to encounter if you went bishop e3 first, but beyond that, there aren't too many big differences for our purposes. Now, in these last 2 videos, I want to show you some different lines where black does go for the line starting with e5, knight b3, then bishop e6, and finally bishop e3. Here in game number 1 against Ding Liren went h5. That is the strongest and most popular idea at the highest level right now. However, of course, black does have many other options from here, and if you are going to play the English attack with the moves bishop e3 and f3 as white, then it is very important to understand what to do when black does not go h5. And trust me, if you made it this far, this game right here, game number 4 against Daniel Naroditsky, is going to blow your mind. It is one of Magnus Carlsen's greatest comeback games I have ever seen. All right, from here, black went bishop e7, Magnus queen d2, now short castles and long castles from white. So far, so good. And now here in this position, Daniel Naroditsky busted out an old but still very popular idea, that is a5 expanding on the queen side. Now this does look a little bit strange at first glance. I mean, typically in the Najdorf, black is expanding on the queen side with the move b5. However, a5 is completely different. Now, what is black's idea with this move, and why is it so scary for white to face? Well, black's idea is simple. He wants to go a4, knocking off the knight off the b3 square, and potentially even a3. Now, if that pawn does get all the way to the a3 square, that is going to be a thorn in white's position, and no matter what white does, he's going to be in trouble. So with that in mind, in this position, the standard move according to theory and modern praxis is the idea of a4, clamping down on the queen side, stopping the a4 advance once and for all. Now, this is not the move Magnus Carlsen played in the game. In the game, Magnus went g4, and this is a big mistake, and I'm going to show you why in 1 second. However, I do want to cover what white should be trying to do with the move a4 in this position here. Now, after a4, black's main idea is to try and capitalize on the newly weakened b4 square from white. Of course, going a4 stops the idea of going a3 forever, and that means b4 is going to be permanently weak. So now black typically goes knight to a6 or knight c6, followed by knight b4. White's going to expand on the king side, then go rook b1. Black typically goes rook to c8. And from here, we have a very tense game. White can go g5 immediately. Meanwhile, black is trying to get in that d5 break in the center. And if white ever takes on the d5 square, then black can take back with the knight on the b4 square. And black's going to have a great game with that one extra central pawn in the center. Now, heading way back in this position, instead of the move a4, here Magnus Carlsen goes g4. And this is why this is not the best idea here. Here, black simply goes a4, knocking back the knight. Now, as you can see, all of these squares, a5, c5, and d4 are covered by black. That means white has to go back to the a1 square with the knight. Now, that knight on a1 does not make a very good impression no matter what way you're looking at it. And here, black, the best move is simply knight d7, continuing development, perhaps following up with moves like b5 in the near future, or even a rook to c8 continuing development. However, instead of that, here Daniel Naroditsky, this is a blitz game. He wanted to put maximum pressure on Magnus as quickly as possible. He does that with the move a3. And here, white has a very difficult choice. Do you do nothing, allowing a takes b3? Do you simply advance the pawn to the b3 square, stopping any sort of opening up the queen side? Or do you take on the a3 square, exposing your king? Well, there's no easy choice in the game. Magnus went b3, trying to keep the queen side closed. This is the best move. However, it does weaken these dark squares permanently around the king. So now, for example, if black ever tries to get a queen perhaps somehow onto the c3 square or on this diagonal, that would threaten some sort of checkmating idea on the b2 square. So for that reason, white's going to have to be very careful about guarding that c3 and b2 square for the rest of this game. Now from here, Daniel Naroditsky brings out the knight to c6, solid idea, and Magnus expands on the king side with the move g5. Now of course, there were some stronger ideas available. The best idea would have been knight b5, intending the move c4, expanding on the queen side, and from there you have this weird sort of like blockade on the light squares with these pawns. And again, typically you're not going to expand on the side where you have your king in these opposite sides castling positions, but the English attack in the Najdorf is just one of those openings where both sides sort of can attack and expand on both sides of the board depending on the exact position. So it's a good little idea to keep in mind. Now in the game, g5 for Magnus. Here, knight to h5 is the best idea for Daniel. From there, the knight stops white's idea of h4, then h5, and it also controls that f4 square, stopping f4 ideas temporarily. So knight to h5, kind of weird putting the knight on the edge of the board, but in these sorts of positions with the e5 Najdorf English attack, it does work out pretty well. Now instead, knight d7 on the board from black, a weaker move getting the king away from the defense of the black king. And now Magnus jumps in with the knight to the d5 square, a very thematic idea in these structures, not the best idea in this exact position, and I'm going to show you why. But overall, in most positions, this idea, knight d5, very, very common. Now black takes on d5, white takes back, and here black actually sacrifices a pawn. He jumps in with the knight to the d4 square, knight d4 on the board. And this is by far the best move. Here, if white wants to win that pawn, he's going to have to give up his dark squared bishop. And this means black's remaining dark squared bishop is going to be incredibly strong. And again, this is a very important detail. White's already weakened the dark squares around his king. If he gives up his bishop, he's going to be even weaker on the dark squares on the queen side. And that is what Magnus does, and it is the best move. Bishop takes d4 on the board. Black takes back with the e-pawn, and now black has this hanging pawn on the d4 square. However, his pawn on g5 is also extremely weak. If he wants to win d4 and have a clean pawn, he's going to have to defend g5 first. Now, real fast, if white takes on d4, that is an absolutely terrible move, and I want to show you why. Here, queen takes d4 is obviously met by the move bishop takes g5. Now, from here, that bishop is attacking the king on c1. The king has to move. King b1 is the best move. But then the key move for black is bishop to f6. And here we see the bishop just dominating this long diagonal. Of course, the queen has to move. Now the bishop eyes the entire diagonal here. He both attacks the white king and defends the king side of black. And then after queen c7, further increasing the pressure on this square on c3, black is going to have a tremendous game, and white's in a lot of trouble. Now, of course, Magnus saw all of this in the game. He does not play queen takes d4. That would be a massive mistake. So instead, Magnus needs to defend that pawn on the g5 square first. And the best ways to do it are simply f4 or h4. Now in the game, Magnus goes f4, defending the pawn. Here, black needs to find a good way to counterattack and get some play going. It turns out the best way to do that is actually with the good old Ben Feingold counterattack. Yes, that's right, his favorite signature move, f6. Now, Ben Feingold may not be a big fan of this move in general, but here it works out quite well. Black's idea is once again targeting the pawn on the g5 square, and if white takes it, then black can recapture with the bishop or the knight and have a great game. So f6, probably the best idea and a good thematic idea in these structures. Black is actually often trying to open up the f-file in these English attack lines with the move e5 earlier in the game. However, instead of that, rook e8 on the board. And the idea behind this move is very simple. Black wants to go bishop f8 next. From there, the bishop is defending the king side very well. It may even be activated on the long diagonal with g6 and then bishop g7. And then also that rook on e8 will control the e-file very nicely. So overall, a very good regrouping idea from black. Now here, Magnus continues the attack. h4, his idea. Obviously, he wants to go h5, then g6, opening up the king side. And here, black continues his plan. Bishop f8, and Magnus does the same. h5 on the board. Now, phase one of both players' plan is complete. Black with that rook e8, bishop f8 regrouping, white with pushing the pawns all the way up to the g5 and h5 squares. Now, what is Daniel supposed to do here? Well, he finds a very creative and very strong idea. Knight to c5. The idea of this move is you are controlling the e4 square, and now either the knight or the rook can jump into that square. And if the rook gets here, it's going to defend the d4 pawn and attack f4. That's going to be a very strong idea. Now in the game, Magnus finally captures that pawn on the d4 square. This was necessary. Again, black was threatening rook to e4, but now black jumps in with the rook all the same, rook to e4 on the board. So again, very strong move, targeting the queen and putting pressure on f4. Now Magnus, he retreats the queen while maintaining the defense of that pawn on the f4 square. Solid move. And here Daniel goes rook to c8, activating the rook on the c-file. Of course, the rook did its job on the a-file, supporting that pawn to the a3 square. And here that pawn on a3 is not in any danger at all, so therefore rook to c8, a very solid move. However, real fast, I do want to show you a mind-boggling idea that black has here in this position on move 22. Here, the top engine idea, believe it or not, is the move h6. Now, this looks completely insane. I mean, black typically in these structures does not want to do anything to help white blow open the king side. However, here it works out. If white is dumb enough to take that pawn on h6, this weakens the dark squares, and here black can jump in with the queen to the f6 square, literally threatening checkmate in one move. So the idea of h6 by black, it is a deflection move, trying to deflect the g-pawn away from the defense of the f6 square, allowing queen to f6 ideas. So that is a very cool idea to keep in mind in your own games. Now instead, rook c8 on the board. Now Magnus, king b1, very solid developing move, getting the king out of those x-ray attacks with the rook. Very good idea. Of course, there were some other ideas Magnus could have played. Rook to h3 is one, the idea being you activate the rook along that third rank, potentially defending the c3 square further. And also bishop to h3 would have been quite interesting, activating this bishop on this diagonal here and controlling the c8 square. Now from here for black, once again, the best move is going to be that h6 resource for the same idea. If white takes on h6, black jumps in with the queen, queen to f6, threatening checkmate in one move. But instead, Daniel misses it. He plays the queen to the b6 square, queen to b6 on the board instead. Now here, Magnus does find that rook to h3 idea we talked about earlier, the idea being the rook is now activated along the third rank. It defends all these squares, but especially that weak dark square c3. Now here in this position, Daniel Naroditsky finds the h6 idea we talked about earlier. However, here it's played one move too late. Of course, the key idea behind this move is after g takes h6, black was going to have that queen to f6 idea. But now black has to waste yet another tempo going back with the queen and only then queen g6. So overall, kind of a misplay by black. And now instead of immediately taking on h6, what Pierre Magnus finds an even stronger idea. That is simply c4, expanding on the queen side. So we saw a little bit earlier, white had this resource early in the game with the idea of knight to b5, then following up c4. So it's cool to see Magnus finally get this cool idea in the game. Now, of course, this is a double-edged move. White does control more space, and those pawns on a2, b3, c4, and d5 make a very strong impression. However, there is all this loft on the queen side now, and if black can regroup his pieces, perhaps get some pieces on these diagonals, white's king is going to feel very vulnerable here. Now in the game, black takes on g5 with the pawn, white takes back, and then Daniel Naroditsky decides it is time to put pressure on that pawn on the g5 square and try to stop white's advance. Now in the game, he does that with the move rook to g4. The idea is you want to stop the g6 advance from white. However, this turns out to not be a very good idea. The better version of this strategy would have been rook to e5. Now from here, Daniel would be putting pressure on that g5 square, and he also threatens knight to e4. From e4, that knight would be hitting the queen, so overall, this would be a very strong regrouping idea from black. Now, instead of this, rook g4 on the board. This move obviously is designed to stop the g6 advance from white. From there, white is trying to open up the game. If black would respond f6, that h6 would be the right counter for white, and the entire king side is getting blown open, obviously. However, it turns out this move actually does not stop g6 at all. Here, the best move, believe it or not, is the brilliant idea g6. You are sacrificing that pawn, and here's why it works out. Here, black takes the pawn twice, first with the f pawn, then with the rook. Here, the key move for white is queen to c2, and obviously this move targets the rook on the g6 square, but beyond that, you have the discovered attack on the h7 square, meaning if the rook moves, then queen to h7 is coming from white, and here black's position is already extremely critical. Now, instead of this, in the game, Magnus Carlsen decides it is time to bring that knight on the a1 square into the game, and obviously the only legal move for the knight is going to be knight c2. That is what Magnus played in the game. Very solid idea. Now black, knight to e4, good move, putting pressure on the queen, and especially good in blitz where you're trying to win the initiative at all costs. Now here, Magnus obviously has to move the queen. The question is, where do you move it? Well, all of these squares look playable at first glance, both e3, e2, and e1. In the game, Magnus goes queen to e2, but it turns out this is actually a blunder. Instead, queen to e3 or queen to e1 would have been better, but when the queen goes on e2, it stops the bishop's connection to the pawn on the c4 square. And believe it or not, this is a deadly mistake. Here, Daniel Naroditsky has the insane idea. Rook takes c4, a temporary, and I do mean temporary, rook sacrifice. Now, first of all, b takes c4 is not possible. Obviously, that pawn is pinned to the king by the queen. So instead of that, here the move is queen takes c4, but this loses on the spot to the move knight d2 check. Of course, the knight hitting the king, but you also open this discovered attack of the rook on the queen. And then after rook takes d2, black wins the queen. So rewinding here a little bit, why is queen e2 not the move? Well, if you went queen to e1, for example, then if black played rook takes c4, then you simply recapture with the bishop, and then if black goes knight d2, there is no discovered attack on the queen on the e1 square by the rook. Obviously, the rook can't go in that direction. So, big tactical oversight by Magnus Carlsen in extreme time pressure, very understandable. Instead, queen e2, the idea is he's pressuring both the knight on e4 and the rook on the g4 square. And in the game, this works out for Magnus, as Daniel Naroditsky does not see this rook takes c4 idea. Instead, he jumps in with the queen to the g1 square, defending the rook. Queen g1 on the board, again defending g4. And now Magnus finally goes g6. Again, the idea trying to blow open the kingside. If black is to go s6, try to block it, Magnus has that h6 resource, so that obviously is not going to work. Now here, Daniel finds a very cool idea, rook to e8, once again setting up various discovered ideas against the queen. So for example, knight to c3 check is a double attack on both the king and the queen with the knight and the rook. That would be deadly. For that reason here, Magnus has to respond immediately. Now from here, Magnus does go queen to f3. Not a terrible move, but obviously you are missing the idea of simply taking on f7 immediately, then going to f3 with the queen with check. Now would have been a lot stronger. Simply she takes f7 immediately. Instead, queen to f3 on the board. And the reason this is a mistake is here black can simply win the pawn, and that is what he does. F takes g6, and then rook takes g6 on the board. And here, if we compare this position to the other one, where Magnus could have taken on f7 immediately, in this position after king takes, Magnus is still going to have that pawn on h5. That could be a battering ram, try to further blow up on the king side. However, going back to the main position in the game, after queen f3 takes and takes on g6, here obviously Magnus does not have that one extra pawn. And for that reason, this whole line is a little bit weaker for Magnus. Now here, Magnus does make the best of his position. He jumps in with the queen to the h5 square, obviously with a double attack on the rook and these squares on the h-file attacking black's king. Now from here, black goes rook to e5. Good move, pressuring the queen and making sure the rook is now defended by the pawn. Magnus jumps in with the queen to the h7 square, checking the king. Black goes king f7. That is forced. Now here in this position, obviously both sides in massive time pressure. Magnus only having 1 minute left on the clock in this blitz game, and Daniel down to 25 seconds. Here, Magnus plays a big mistake. That is bishop to e2. Now, what is the problem with this move? Well, this is a good time for a puzzle. If you like chess puzzles, pause the video right now and try to solve this problem. I mean, this is pretty much a chess.com puzzle right here. All right, the key idea for black, of course, is knight to d2 with the discovered attack by the rook on the bishop on the e2 square. Now, you might be thinking, why can't white just take the knight on the d2 square with the rook and defend the bishop? Well, the problem is the rook is pinned to the king by the queen. Rook takes d2 is not a legal move. Wow, this is getting spicy. All right, in the game, Magnus goes king to c1, the best move. But then rook takes e2, and now, yes, the queen is technically sort of hanging, but white can't take it. If you go rook takes g1, then rook takes g1 back. And here, obviously, white is in big trouble. The only way to delay checkmate is knight to e1, then rook takes, and then the final moves are king c2, knight to e4 check, king d3, and finally rook d2 is checkmate. So all this to say, obviously, rook takes g1 in that position was not a good idea. It leads to a forced mate from black. All right, instead, obviously, after rook takes e2, here, Magnus Carlsen, he brings his queen back to the h5 square. A good move, trying to exert pressure on that rook on e2. Now, of course, here, it's important to note, Daniel Naroditsky is up an entire piece. He has that extra bishop after white's bishop on e2 was just lost to the rook. So can Daniel convert this, or is Magnus going to come back in this game? Let's find out. All right, from here, queen g2 from black, increasing the pressure on this second rack against Magnus. Now Magnus, he gives the king a check. Good idea, forcing king g8. And then he swings back with the queen to the d3 square, trying to increase the defense of his king with that queen firepower. Now here, the best move for black, of course, is going to be knight to e4. From there, you're just further opening up the lines of attack for all your pieces, the rook and the queen especially. However, instead of that, here, Daniel plays an unthinkable move. I really don't know what he was thinking when he played this move beyond just being in time pressure. Here, he actually gives up the knight on the b3 square for a pawn, and there's no follow-up. It's just knight takes b3, queen takes, and that's it. He literally gave up his minor piece advantage, and now he's up one pawn in this position. He's still better, but black's lead is just nowhere near what it was before. All right, now black, rook to f6, good move, setting up rook to f1 ideas next. Now Magnus, rook c3, further increasing defense of that knight on the c2 square, and rook f to f2 from Daniel. Of course, there are various threats now. Potentially, rook takes c2 in the future. Now here, Magnus, if he just sits around and waits, he's going to get blown off the board. So he plays a very thematic English attack idea. That is expanding on the queenside where he is castled. He goes c5. Now this move here, absolutely brilliant, trying to create a pass pawn on the queenside. That may be the only thing he can do to distract Daniel from his attack. Now, does it work? Let's find out. Bishop e7 from Daniel. His idea, obviously, bishop f6, good idea. Now, c6 from Magnus. All right, Daniel, bishop g5, check, hitting the king. King b1, and here Daniel plays bishop f6. This move looks logical, but this is a massive blunder. Real fast, instead of bishop f6, the key idea for black was actually rook to f1, trying to remove that knight on the d1 square. And then if Magnus plays the best move, the winning idea, which is rook d3, then the winning idea for Daniel, believe it or not, is the unbelievable bishop to d2, blocking the communication of the rooks. Now, if you want to figure out what happens from here, I'll let you play through this variation on your own outside of this video. I got to go back to the game. This video is long enough as is. Here in the game, bishop f6 from black. And again, this is a massive blunder. Here, Magnus just goes c7, and now there is literally nothing black can do to stop the idea of c8 turning the pawn into a queen, and that is exactly what happens. Bishop takes, then c8 queen. The king moves, and then queen c takes c3. Not queen b takes c3, queen c takes c3. That detail is very important, chess YouTube. Now black, rook f1, try to get something going, but here Magnus, those two queens are simply too powerful. He swats virtually everything away, takes the rook, then takes the queen. Magnus has 2 queens versus 0. Daniel fights on in time pressure, but it is not enough. And in this position, when Magnus has 2 queens and the knight, Daniel responds on the spot to Magnus. Now, finally, in game number 5, we have Magnus Carlsen facing off against Wesley So from the 2015 Seinfeld Cup tournament. Now, in the game, Wesley obviously went for the Najdorf variation with a6, and our hero, Magnus Carlsen, as usual, goes bishop e3, the English attack. Now, once again, we're looking at more lines where black goes e5, lines we have not covered yet. You don't want to miss this game. In the game, black goes e5. Now, knight b3 from white, the standard move, bishop e6 and f3. Once again, the starting point for the e5 line in the English attack against the Najdorf. Now, so far, we've looked at lines where black goes h5, trying to stop the g4 advance from white. Also, ones where black goes bishop e7, short castles, and then the move a5, expanding on the queen side. Those 2 ideas are very common. However, there is a third idea. That is the very fast b5 advance from black, trying to counterplay on the queen side as quickly as possible. So here is a great example of that. In the game, Wesley So goes knight b to d7, a good move. Now Magnus Carlsen, queen d2. Of course, the move g4 immediately also possible in this position. It's really a matter of taste. I guess most moves, white is going to go queen d2 next. For example, at bishop e7, then queen d2 is the move. Same thing after h6, then queen d2 is the move from white. However, there are some differences. If black does go knight b6 here, believe it or not, he's threatening the move d5. He now has both of those knights defending that d5 square. With that in mind, here white needs to immediately knock off that knight off the f6 square where it is defending d5. For example, knight to h5, then queen d2. And finally, there's the immediate b5 advance from black here. In that case, white can do just about whatever he wants. Queen d2 is playable, as well as the immediate g5 and even the immediate a4. So overall, queen d2 from Magnus Carlsen, probably a safer move. However, g4 in this position also very playable for white. Now, queen d2 on the board. Again, in the prior 2 games, we saw h5 and bishop e7 ideas. Here instead, Wesley So goes for the immediate expansion on the queen side with the move b5. Now here, right off the bat, we have to ask, is the move b4 from black a threat? And in this position, the answer is no. If that was the case, white would simply respond knight to d5, a move he very often wants to make in the English attack anyway, so that is not a big deal at all. With that in mind, here, Magnus Magnus Carlsen, long castles. Wesley So goes bishop e7, very typical developing move. And now, of course, Magnus Carlsen starts the attack on the king side with that move g4 we talked about so much in this video. Now, of course, White's idea is g5, try to knock the knight off the f6 square, fighting for the d5 square, and potentially getting those kingside pawns rolling down the board. Now, from here, Black has a very, very big decision to make. The key moves for Black are going to be short castles on the king side and the move b4. Now, in the game, Black went b4, but this is the less common idea. More common in general is the move short castles, and I do want to very quickly cover the main ideas in this position. Here, White's best move is g5, knocking off the knight, and now Black has a choice. He can either go knight to h5, or he can immediately counterattack on the queen side with the move b4, try to hit the knight on the c3 square. Now, in this position, the move knight to h5 is more solid. It's the recent favorite of Maxime Vachiere-Lagrave, a big Najdorf specialist. We saw his game earlier in this video. And from here, White's plans are pretty simple. They typically involve moves like king to b1, rook g1, h4, maybe knight d5, just kind of playing all over the board with very typical moves we've seen throughout this video. However, if Black goes for the alternative, b4, this is an absolutely notorious line. The theory here is very, very heavy. Now here, g takes f6 is definitely the simpler move. Then Black's going to take the knight on the c3 square. It's the only way to not drop a piece. White responds queen takes c3. Black takes back on f6 with the knight. And then finally, White jumps in with his own knight to the a5 square, threatening knight to c6 ideas. So this line is pretty good for White. White is definitely fighting for an edge. However, the more complicated variation, if you're into that sort of thing, maybe you are, is definitely going to be the move knight to e2 in this position. From here, Black typically goes knight to e8. And from there, it's pretty much an all-out attacking game with both sides trying to push their pawns down the board literally as fast as they possibly can. Here, the main line continues f4 from White, a5 for Black, then f5, and finally a4. Here, White can go knight d4 or take on e6. The game is super, super complicated. Again, a typical English attack style position with attacking on opposite sides of the board. Now, heading way back, instead of the move short castles on move 11, of course, Wesley So does go for b4 in this game. Now here, what are White's options? Well, as usual in this kind of position, the best move for White is going to be knight to d5. Now instead, knight e2 and knight a4 are technically playable, but they're not that great. If White goes knight to e2, then h6 from Black pretty much shuts down the idea of the g5 advance. And meanwhile, if White goes knight to a4 in this position, then Black can simply go rook to b8, defending the pawn on the b4 square, and overall he has a pretty good game in this position. I mean, just look at that knight on the e4 square. It's definitely out of play for right now. Now, instead of that, Magnus Carlsen does go for the move knight to d5 in this position right here. He definitely studied his English attack theory at some point. Knight d5 on the board. And now, of course, as usual, the threat is knight takes e7. If that bishop falls, then that d6 pawn will fall as well, as that bishop is the key defender of the pawn. For example, a5, then White simply goes knight takes e7. Then after queen takes d6, and White is up a clean pawn. You can't allow that as Black, so with that in mind, bishop takes d5 is the standard idea. Now, White takes back on d5, and in the game, Wesley So goes for a very strong move, knight to b6. Now, this is a very important move to be aware of. Here, with the knights on the b6 and the f6 squares, they're both fighting for that pawn on the d5 square. And of course, if Black takes a pawn, for example, king b1, then knight takes, obviously, White cannot take back the knight on the d5 square with the queen, because then the other knight would recapture back, so that is no good. So with that in mind, what else can White do in this position right here? He obviously can't really defend the pawn on d5. Bishop c4 is not possible, as the knight also controls that square. Well, winning the pawn on the b4 square is an option. Let's see how this one works out. Here, Black obviously can take on d5. Then the best move is actually bishop takes b6. You ignore the threat on your own queen by counterattacking on Black's queen. And then after knight takes b6, we have a roughly level game where both sides are doing pretty well. I mean, obviously, this knight on b3 is not that great of a piece, but neither is the knight on the b6 square, and overall, both sides are going to have decent chances here. Now, instead of this, in the game, Magnus Carlsen jumps forward with the knight to the a5 square. knight to a5 on the board. And once again, this is a very common thematic idea in the English attack. The idea is the knight wants to jump into that very powerful c6 square. I mean, from c6, that knight is going to be an absolute monster, and there's pretty much no piece that can really challenge it. Both of black's knights, the knight on f6 and on b6, are going to be very, very far away from the c6 square, and black lacks a light squared bishop that he could normally use to win that knight. Now, in response here, Wesley So captures the pawn on d5 with the b knight. Obviously, both knight recaptures are both very, very playable. It doesn't make that big of a difference in the game. Now, knight b takes d5, and here, instead of knight to c6, which looks like the strongest idea to me, the most thematic, here Magnus Carlsen jumps back with the knight to the c4 square. So this is very puzzling. Real fast, the idea of knight c6, of course, is you fork both the queen and that pawn on the b4 square, and then you win it back with the knight. Instead, after knight to c4, that pawn is going to stand there on b4, and Magnus Carlsen, not only that, he's losing the bishop on the e3 square if black wants it, and in the game, Wesley So does take it. Knight takes e3 on the board, then knight takes, and finally short castles. So here, the dust has settled a little bit. Black is up a pawn. He does have an extra central pawn. However, of course, white does have complete domination of this d5 square, and his attack on the king side is coming very fast with moves like h4 to h5, g5 to g6, and so on. So overall, white is down a pawn, yes, but he does have very strong compensation for it. Now from here, Magnus does have a few different options. g5 and h4, perfectly good ideas, but instead he takes control of the d5 square further with the move bishop to c4. Now, this is a very interesting move. From here, the bishop does a great job of controlling this diagonal, and it may even play a role in the defense up the queen side here. Now, black from here, knight d7, getting out of the way of a future g5 advance. Perfectly fine idea. Magnus goes h4, technically sacrificing a pawn on h4. Of course, taking that pawn would be nearly suicide. Bishop takes h4, opens up the h-file way too much. That is simply way too dangerous for black. So instead of that, a5 was the move from black. Wesley So definitely knows his stuff here, and now Magnus g5 further expanding on the king side. Now Wesley So continues on the queen side, rook to c8, Magnus goes bishop d5, then knight b6, and king b1. So far so good. Both sides just kind of building up in the attack. Black queen c7, Magnus rook h to f1. And this is pretty much where we're hitting a boiling point. Both sides have most of their pieces on the most aggressive squares. It's very difficult for either side to make progress without pushing those pawns down the board at some point here, which means things are about to get very serious. All right, in the game, black takes the bishop on the d5 square. This turns out to be a mistake. Instead, the best move was queen to c5, just increasing the pressure on the bishop without committing to anything just yet. Now instead, knight takes d5 on the board. Now knight takes, and just look at the difference in the quality of these minor pieces. This knight alone literally gives more than enough compensation for that missing pawn. Meanwhile, this bishop on the e7 square is doing virtually nothing in this position. Now from here, of course, the queen on the c7 square is being attacked. Queen b7 is the move getting out of the attack, putting pressure on d5, and further setting up that future a4 and b3 advance. Now white here, Magnus immediately counterattacks on the king side with the move f4. This is going to be his key break in this game. And of course, the threat from here, if black doesn't take it seriously, is going to be f5 and then f6. And that pawn on the f6 square is going to force a massive concession from black. So of course, Wesley So sees this, and he responds. In the game, his move is f5. Now, this move f5 is relatively common in these e5 English attack structures for black. It's definitely not a bad move here. However, instead, the good old-fashioned Ben Feingold counterattack with his signature move f6 may have been a little bit stronger in the game. The idea is if white goes g6, trying to blow open the king side, black can go h6, and now from here, the king side is mostly blocked. Yes, the king is very vulnerable with this pawn acting as a wedge on the g6 square, but there's definitely no immediate breakthrough for white either. Now, instead of all this, f5 was played in the game. Of course, the drawback of this move is it does weaken the king side a little bit, particularly that pawn on the e5 square, and here Magnus simply eyes it with the queen. Queen to e3. Of course, the threat now is simply f takes e5, and then queen takes after black takes back with the pawn. So what is black going to do about this? Well, it turns out there isn't a whole lot black actually can do about this threat without further weakening his position. So, for example, here the engine likes the idea of simply a4, continuing the attack on the queen side, or instead rook to e8, preemptively defending the bishop and also aligning that rook with white's queen on the e3 square. So both of those moves were the best options. Instead, in the game, e4 is played from Wesley So, and this move is quite surprising. This was a classical game played in the Sanglefeld Cup in 2015, meaning Wesley So did theoretically have plenty of time to calculate the implications of this move. And now here the big problem is white can push the h-pawn, h5, and then h6, and if black ever goes g6, then literally all of these dark squares in the position are going to be so weak, and white's queen obviously has access to the d4 square, and now with that pawn on g5, black's bishop never has access to f6, so that queen is going to be an absolute monster on this long diagonal. So with that in mind, Magnus immediately expands on the king side with the key move h5, and of course the idea is you want to follow up with the further advance of the pawn to h6. Now again, white's obvious idea is to try and force out the move g6 from black, at which point this entire diagonal is going to be so weak for black. And unfortunately for Wesley So, he doesn't really have a good choice here. g6 was played in the move, and there weren't too many alternatives. Now real fast, it may look like black can win the knight on the d5 square with the move rook takes d5. However, this move is not as strong as it looks at first. Now, if you like puzzles, this is yet another good time for a puzzle. Go ahead and pause the video right now and try to find the right solution for white. Try to figure out why rook takes d5 is not as strong as it looks like it is at first. Well, I hope you found a solution. The key move here for white obviously is going to be queen to b3. The idea is that rook on the d5 square is now pinned to the king, and that's going to cause all sorts of problems for black. Now, unfortunately for Wesley So, if this was what he played in the game, there's literally no way to defend that rook on d5. The best move for black is a4. Try to deflect the queen and otherwise getting your pawns rolling again, but then queen takes d5 virtually forces the queens to come off the board, and then after g takes and g takes, here white simply has a better endgame with the extra rook versus black's bishop. Now, heading back to the variation in the game, here, instead of rook takes d5, black goes g6. This was the idea we talked about, but now queen to b3 all the same, once again with that discovered attack on the king. And of course, now the threat is simply knight takes e7 with the double attack on the king from both the knight and the queen. That would be absolutely deadly. So obviously black here is going to defend that bishop in advance. Now, of course, knight takes e7 will be met by queen takes e7, and black's doing perfectly fine, so not a big deal. Now, here in the game, Magnus Carlsen takes a moment to try and lock down the queen side. He does that with the move a4. Very reasonable idea. Of course, not the only option. I could have also played rook to f2, preparing rook d2 ideas, or simply rook d4, setting up rook d1. But overall, a4, very interesting idea by Magnus Carlsen. You don't see it too often in the English attack. Now, here, black, of course, the bishop is being attacked on the e7 square. Black decides that it's finally time to keep the bishop alive with the move bishop d8. Now, of course, knight takes e7 idea is no longer possible, but Magnus not too amused. He just continues rook d4, solid idea. Of course, the follow-up is rook f to d1, and that's what happens in the game. From here, Wesley So, king to f8, trying to get his king further away from the king side. That is just a danger zone with that pawn on h6, permanently controlling the g7 square. Now, Magnus, rook f d1, simple development, and here black makes a little bit of a mistake. He goes rook to c6. Now, this move looks logical, simply supporting the pawn on that d6 square. However, if that was the goal, black probably should have played rook to d7 instead, from there supporting d6. So, what is the problem with rook to c6? The problem is very simple. This move blocks the queen's communication with the knight on the d5 square, and here Magnus Carlsen immediately takes advantage of that with the move knight to e3, and now the threat is simply queen to d5. From there, the rook would be pinned, and Magnus Carlsen will have a tremendous amount of pressure with maybe knight c4 coming after queen to d5. Now from here, black goes bishop to b6, putting the question to the rook on the d4 square, what are you going to do? And here Magnus, he ignores the threat and goes knight to c4. Okay, this is a very puzzling move. I mean, that pawn on the d6 square here is simply hanging. Magnus could take it, and then after rook takes, of course, the bishop is attacking the knight, but the knight is defended by the queen on the b3 square. Now, perhaps Magnus Carlsen didn't like this, as he wanted to try and keep some more pieces on the board. He liked his rooks a little better than black, so instead of that, knight c4 was the move. However, here Wesley So has the resource queen to c7, putting pressure on the knight, and from there, Magnus would be forced to simply trade the knight for the bishop on b6, and black would be doing relatively okay. So, for example, queen c7, hitting the knight, knight, forcing knight takes and queen takes. And here again, black has a decent position, but instead of queen to c7, Wesley So misses that idea. He does immediately take the rook, and he's basically falling right into Magnus Carlsen's trap in this position. Oh no, the sneaky Magnus Carlsen. Okay, that bishop on b6, it had to stay on b6, because it was guarding the a5 square. And now after bishop takes d4, the move from Magnus obviously is going to be knight takes a5, forking both the queen and the rook. Now, of course, the queen moves. White takes the rook on the c5 square. And now, once again, black has a choice. If you take the knight with the queen, then Magnus takes the bishop with the rook. This is tremendous for Magnus, believe it or not. So instead of that, bishop c5 is the move, trying to keep the bishop alive. However, after queen d5, we can see Magnus not only dominating these dark squares over here, but also the light squares over here on the queen side. So as we transition into more of the late middle game phase of this game, Magnus Carlsen's English attack is just looking to be too much for Wesley So to handle. Now here, Wesley, he does find a very important resource. That is the move e3, simply advancing the passed pawn, getting it one step closer to promoting. And on e3, it is very well supported by that bishop on c5. So very solid idea, but now Magnus a5, he's doing the same, simply advancing his advanced pass pawn on the queen side and knocking on the door of that queen. Now the queen has to move. Wesley So chooses queen to b5, not the best move. And here Magnus jumps into d8 with the knight targeting the rook. Now the rook swings over to the a7 square, knight to e6 from Magnus Carlsen, king goes to e8, and now the best idea for Magnus is you start by taking on the c5 square, and then almost no matter what black does, you go queen g8 check, and then win the pawn on h7 with check. So for example, queen takes c5, the best move, queen g8 check, king d7, queen takes h7, and from there you can further gobble up this pawn on the g6 square, and then just threaten to promote your pawn on h7 to h8. So this would have been the fastest way to victory for Magnus. Instead, he misses the idea. He retreats the knight back to the d4 square, and this does hit the queen, but here, Wesley So simply takes the pawn on a5, and actually threatens checkmate on the a1 square. So that one little mistake by Magnus, now Wesley So has some big threats in this game. Now Magnus queen g8 check, same idea we talked about earlier, forcing the king to the 7th rank, and then he simply takes the pawn on a7, king c8, and now of course taking on g6 is not possible because then queen to a1 is going to be checkmate. That's no good. So instead here Magnus has to finesse the position a little bit. Here he goes queen g8 check, once again giving the king a little bit of a tickle there. Now king b7, and finally the move c3, offering that c2 square as a safe haven for the king in the event of queen to a1. Now instead of queen a1, here black takes the pawn on the c3 square. Magnus drops back the bishop to b3, again checking the king, then queen to b6, and finally the queens come off the board. Queen takes, king takes, and then finally a few more trades. Magnus takes the pawn, black takes the knight, and white takes back the bishop with the rook. Now in the end, we have this rook endgame, both sides having a rook and a whole bunch of pawns over here on the king side. And material may be even, however, the deciding factor in this position, of course, is that advanced protected pass pawn on the h-file. Stopping that pawn is going to be just an absolute nightmare for Wesley So. And here's the rest of the game. As usual, Magnus Carlsen just cleaning up in this position with his usual endgame technique. And in the end, that advanced pawn on h6 just gives black too much to worry about. Now black is losing the pawn on the g6 square. Of course, if king to f7, then Magnus simply goes rook to g7, winning the pawn on g6. And with two protected pass pawns on the king side, that is going to be all she wrote in this game. So for that reason, on move 56, Wesley So resides on the spot to Magnus Carlsen. Wow, what a series of games. All right, Chess YouTube, I genuinely hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you got something out of it and loved it as much as I loved making it. And most of all, I hope you feel ready to use the English attack as white in your own online blitz games, or even your over-the-board classical or blitz games if you're into that sort of thing. And as a side note, I play the English attack as white a lot against the Najdorf. To me, it's the most fun variation to play with those crazy opposite sides castling positions. And if you've never tried it, I highly recommend trying the English attack in your own games after watching this video. I think you'll agree it is a lot of fun. Now, if you enjoyed this video and got value out of this content, please give me some love. Smash that like button. Subscribe to my channel to get more videos just like this. And while you're at it, check out my Magnus Carlsen playlist. And I will see you in the next video.